Welcome to the Mini Book Podcast. You know, we often think about tuberculosis as something from the past, like a Victorian-era disease.
Right. Like something you'd read about in a Dickens novel.
Exactly. But the reality is very different, and it's something we're going to explore today. We're diving deep into tuberculosis, a disease that, despite being curable for decades, still claims over 1 million lives each year.
It's a really complex story, one that intersects with history, poverty, and even our own perceptions of disease. And to guide us through this, we're going to be using John Green's new book, Everything is Tuberculosis.
It's a fascinating read, packed with insights, and it really gets you thinking about why TB has had such a lasting impact. So for everyone listening, consider this your crash course on tuberculosis, its history, and why it's still such a major problem.
Absolutely. And the central question we're grappling with is this: how can a disease that's been curable since the mid-1950s still be one of the deadliest infectious diseases globally? We're talking over 1 million deaths every year, which is just astounding.
It really is. And the fact that it was briefly surpassed by COVID-19 as the leading infectious killer just adds another layer to the story. We're going to look at why it took so long to find a cure and why, even with effective treatments, over 150 million people have died from TB since we figured out how to cure it.
One of the things that struck me is how much our understanding of tuberculosis has changed over time. I mean, if you go back a few centuries, people were trying to make sense of this disease without even knowing about germs.
Right, they had some pretty interesting theories to say the least.
Yeah, like James Watt, the inventor, he approached this disease from a mechanical perspective.
Oh, that's right. His daughter Jessie died from phthisis, which was what they called TB back then. And then his son Gregory got sick too, and Watt was just determined to find a cure.
He was.
He even helped develop this way to give Gregory nitrous oxide, thinking that changing the air he breathed might somehow heal him. It's fascinating to see those brilliant minds working with what they had, even though we know now it wasn't the right approach. Sadly, Gregory also died from consumption in 1804.
It really highlights how little control people had over the disease. And fast forward to the beginning of the 20th century, we're now calling it tuberculosis. And there's this emerging understanding of it as an infectious disease. And John Green actually talks about this shift through his own family history.
Yeah, his great-uncle Stokes Goodrich died from TB in 1930 when he was only 29. It's so sad. He was born in 1900, so he even survived the 1918 flu pandemic, only to die from TB just a few years later.
It's heartbreaking.
And what struck me was that his great-grandfather was a doctor. Imagine having all that medical knowledge, but still being unable to save your own son from this wasting disease.
Absolutely. And when you think about it, the scale of TB's impact is almost incomprehensible. Over the last 2 centuries, we're talking about over 1 billion deaths.
1 billion. That's possibly 1 in 7 people who have ever lived.
It's a mind-boggling number.
It really is. And the fact that we now know how to treat it makes it even more tragic.
Right. And that brings us to the heart of the issue. Why? Why did it take so long to discover the cause and find a cure? And even more importantly, why are people still dying from a curable disease?
Well, if you look at the historical understanding of TB, there were so many different theories. Some thought it was an inherited weakness. Some blamed it on bad air or even evil spirits.
It's amazing how people tried to rationalize it.
I know. Green even mentions that his own great-grandfather, who was a doctor, believed that too much coffee and sugary foods could cause consumption.
It's so interesting how these ideas, even if they were wrong, shaped people's reactions to the illness and even determined who was seen as more susceptible or somehow at fault.
Absolutely. They were basically trying to understand this invisible enemy.
Now, of course, we know that tuberculosis is caused by a specific bacteria, Mycobacterium tuberculosis. It's an airborne infection, which means it spreads through tiny droplets, released when someone with active TB coughs, sneezes, even talks or sings.
And what's really wild is how many people are actually infected. It's estimated that something like 1/4 to 1/3 of the entire global population carries the bacteria.
That's a huge number.
Yeah. But the good news is that for most people, the infection stays dormant. They don't get sick and they can't spread it. However, about 5 to 10% of those infected do develop active TB, especially if their immune system is weakened. Things like HIV, malnutrition, diabetes, even stress can make you more vulnerable.
That connection between TB and malnutrition is especially concerning. In 2023, there were over 5 million people who had both TB and malnutrition. It's a vicious cycle.
Definitely. And because TB thrives in crowded, poorly ventilated places, it disproportionately affects communities living in poverty. It's not just about the bacteria.
It's about the conditions in which people live and their access to healthcare and nutrition. Absolutely. It's a social justice issue as much as a health issue.
You know, John Green himself initially thought of TB as a disease of the past, like something that affected 19th century poets.
Yeah, a romantic ailment.
But his experience in Laka, Sierra Leone really changed his perspective.
That visit to Laka was really powerful, especially his encounter with this young boy named Henry.
And isn't it interesting that Henry shares the same name as Green's son?
It's a remarkable coincidence.
It is. But despite facing so many challenges, Henry said something that really stuck with me. "I am happy, sir. I am encouraged."
It's incredible.
It is. However, the conditions at the Laka TB hospital were really grim. Green describes these poorly ventilated buildings, barred windows, no toilets for patients. He even compares it to a former leprosy isolation facility.
And the physical toll TB takes on people is devastating. He describes seeing these incredibly thin men and women, some vomiting blood and bile. It's a harsh reality.
Another thing that Green emphasizes is the overwhelming hunger that patients experience. The act of infection often suppresses your appetite. Oh, wow. But when you start treatment, as the bacteria die off, this intense hunger returns. He tells this heartbreaking story about a woman named Marie who weighed less than 70 pounds and dreamed about eating mud just to feel full.
It's hard to even imagine.
It is. And tragically, the hospital often couldn't provide enough food because of funding constraints. This lack of proper nutrition actually led some patients to leave and stop taking their medication, which, as we know, can lead to drug resistance. Henry himself described Laka as a place where food and water were scarce.
It shows you that treating TB effectively goes beyond just medication. It requires addressing basic human needs. But what's also interesting is how TB has these unexpected connections to various historical events.
Right. Green highlights some fascinating examples. He talks about how the belief in dry air as a cure for TB actually played a role in New Mexico becoming a state.
That's really interesting.
It is. And in the 19th and early 20th centuries, there was this massive westward migration in the U.S., people heading to places like Arizona and California, hoping that the dry air would cure their consumption. They called it the land of new lungs.
It's amazing how these beliefs shaped people's lives.
It is. And Green also suggests that TB may have even played a minor role in the lead-up to World War I. Apparently, some of the teenagers involved in the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand had TB.
Wow. It's crazy how a disease can intersect with history in such unexpected ways.
And even something as iconic as the cowboy hat might have a connection to TB. Green tells the story of a hat maker who had consumption and moved west for his health in the 1850s. It's these little details that really bring the impact of TB to life.
They do. And speaking of history, when we talk about why TB is still so prevalent in places like Sierra Leone, it's important to look beyond just labeling it a poor country.
You're right. Green actually argues that Sierra Leone is a resource-rich country, especially in terms of minerals and diamonds, but it's been heavily exploited through centuries of colonialism.
He makes a really good point.
He does. And the infrastructure that was built during colonial times, like railroads, wasn't designed to connect communities or benefit the local population. It was all about extracting those valuable resources and shipping them out.
It's like what Dr. Barry said about the railroad lines.
Yeah.
They were built to connect the mines to the ports, not to build a nation.
Exactly. And because of this exploitation, there was very little investment in things like healthcare and education, which are so essential for a country's development.
And that lack of investment has had long-lasting consequences. Green compares the life expectancy in Britain in 1950, which was 69 years, to that in Sierra Leone, after 150 years of colonial rule, which was under 30 years. It really tells you something.
It does. And we can't forget the brutality of the early colonial encounters. Green mentions this historical account by John Serracall, who described the British forces destroying a well-built and clean town in the late 1500s.
It's a reminder of the violence that underpinned colonialism.
And then, of course, came the transatlantic slave trade. The region saw an estimated 400,000 people kidnapped and enslaved, which had a devastating impact on communities and trade networks.
It was a horrific period.
It was. Out of that complex history emerged Freetown, a city initially founded as a place to relocate emancipated slaves. It became home to a diverse population, including Black loyalists who had fought for the British during the American Revolution.
And that's where the Creole people and their unique language originated, which is part of Henry's heritage.
It is. So while acknowledging the poverty that exists in Sierra Leone today, it's important to understand the lasting impact of these historical events. Green even points out that this region was once incredibly wealthy, mentioning the Mali Empire under Mansa Musa in the 14th century.
Yeah, it challenges this simplistic view of Africa as always being impoverished.
And if you look at Henry's own family, his story reflects these larger societal struggles. He was born in a clinic, but a sister had to be born at home because the healthcare system was so strained after years of conflict. His mother, Isatu, had to give up her dream of going to college to work in a market.
It shows how these historical events have a ripple effect through generations. You know, it's interesting how disease, despite being such a universal human experience, is often absent from the grand narratives of history.
You're right, Virginia Woolf actually talked about this, how illness is rarely a central theme in literature.
And there are probably a few reasons for this. Historian Barbara Duden said that pain itself is often invisible to history unless it's recorded. Plus, there's this human tendency to focus on agency and control. It's easier to talk about wars and revolutions than it is to talk about things like a tiny bacterium causing so much suffering.
It's like all the speculation surrounding Alexander the Great's death. We focus on the possibility of poison or assassination, as if accepting death from disease diminishes his legacy.
It's almost as if we can't accept that something so small can have such a huge impact. And TB itself is a very unpredictable disease. It can lie dormant for years, and even after successful treatment, it can relapse.
This unpredictability is all due to the nature of Mycobacterium tuberculosis, the bacteria that causes TB. It's a tough little bugger.
It is, and it's surprisingly common. Over 2 billion people globally are infected with it.
2 billion? That's just incredible. And someone with active, untreated TB can infect something like 10 to 15 people each year.
That's why controlling TB is such a challenge. But what's even more interesting is how slowly this bacteria grows. It takes its time building its thick, waxy cell wall.
So that's its secret weapon.
Exactly. This cell wall makes it incredibly difficult for our immune system to attack it. Our white blood cells basically try to contain it by forming these little clusters called tubercles.
So the bacteria just hang out in these tubercles?
Basically. And that's what we call latent TB. It can stay like this for years without causing any problems. But if your immune system weakens, those bacteria can reactivate and start multiplying, leading to active TB.
And that's when things get really serious.
Yeah. And it's not just HIV or malnutrition that can trigger active TB. It could be stress, air pollution, certain medications.
There are so many factors.
There are. And the way active TB progresses can be really varied. Some people might recover without treatment, though it's rare. Others might live with it for years. But if it's not treated, it can be fatal. And it can be fatal in many ways. Lung collapse, fluid buildup, spread to other organs.
It's not a pleasant way to go.
It's not. And diagnosing TB historically was really difficult. For centuries, doctors didn't have the tools we have today. They had to rely on observing symptoms and asking patients about their history. It was like a medical puzzle.
It must have been so hard to know for sure what was going on.
It was. And one symptom became strongly associated with consumption: coughing up blood. It was considered a sure sign. Even today, you see it in movies and books as a signal that a character has TB.
Yeah, it's like a classic trope.
It is. But it's important to remember that TB can affect other parts of the body, too.
That's right. It's not just a lung disease.
Exactly. It can infect the brain, bones, lymph nodes. It's a very versatile bacteria. And in Henry's case, it was around age 6 that his mother started noticing he was getting tired all the time. It was the first sign that something was wrong.
And he was initially treated with the standard drugs, rifampin, isoniazid, pyrazinamide, ethambutol, we call it RIPE.
And those drugs are pretty old, over 50 years old.
I know. And a major challenge with TB is that the bacteria can become resistant to these drugs.
Right. And that's because bacteria, well, they mutate. And if a mutation makes them less susceptible to a drug, they can survive and multiply even when we're giving the medication.
So it's like an arms race.
Exactly. And historically, diagnosing drug resistance was a slow process. They had to grow the bacteria in a lab, which could take weeks or months. So the standard approach was to give everyone the first-line drugs and only test for resistance if the treatment failed.
Which obviously creates a huge problem, because during that time, the bacteria are multiplying and potentially spreading to others. And in Henry's case, we have to remember that this was happening in Sierra Leone in 2006. The healthcare system was still recovering from the Civil War. They were facing shortages of basic things like clean water and electricity, even in hospitals.
Wow, just imagine trying to provide quality care under those conditions.
And then, to make matters worse, Henry had a relapse during the Ebola outbreak in 2015 to 2016. Oh no. He started having night sweats, fevers, coughing up blood. But people were so afraid of contracting Ebola at hospitals that many delayed seeking treatment.
It's understandable, but it must have made things so much worse.
It did. One doctor, Dr. Berry, actually observed an explosion in drug-resistant TB during that time because people couldn't access medication and couldn't complete their treatment.
Yeah.
And Henry himself was praying for his health every night. He was just a kid facing this terrifying situation.
It's just heartbreaking.
It is. So, by 2016, Henry was clearly struggling. He was tired, losing weight, coughing up blood. His mom took him to Connaught Hospital in Freetown, and he was diagnosed with TB again.
And I'm assuming they weren't able to test for drug resistance right away.
Right. At that time, the rapid molecular tests were still too expensive and not available there, so they started him on the standard RIPE drugs. But they didn't work. His condition continued to deteriorate, and he ended up hospitalized.
It's so frustrating knowing that there might be other treatment options, but they're just not accessible.
It is. And while in the hospital, he felt incredibly lonely and isolated. His roommate even died, which must have been terrifying for him.
And then he developed scrofula, these swollen lymph nodes in his neck that ruptured and became open wounds. My goodness.
It was a difficult time. You know, when we talk about death, we often use the phrase natural causes.
Right.
But it makes me think about this student chaplain who said, death is natural. Children dying is natural. None of us actually want to live in a natural world.
It's a profound statement. It makes you question what we consider natural.
It does. And it makes me think about how we try to understand why bad things happen, especially when it comes to illness. Like in that Kurt Vonnegut poem, Why?
We're always searching for meaning for reasons.
We are. And I think that need for meaning played a part in the romanticization of consumption, which is what they called TB back in the 18th and 19th centuries. It was so widespread that people started associating it with certain personality traits like sensitivity and creativity.
Oh yeah, like the idea that poets and artists were more prone to TB because they were so passionate and sensitive.
Exactly. Especially in Northern Europe, where they thought TB was hereditary. There was even this doctor, Dr. Arthur Jacobson, who proposed this divine compensation theory.
Divine compensation?
Yeah. He basically said that people with TB had shorter lifespans but more intense inner lives, like they were trading physical health for heightened creativity or something.
That's fascinating, but also a bit strange.
It is. And it led to this association of TB with genius, with figures like Stephen Crane and Chopin being cited as examples. But you know, TB was so common back then that it's not surprising many artists would have been affected by it.
Yeah, it's statistically inevitable.
It is. And there's this quote from a London magazine in 1825 that says, "Genius is allied to quick decay." It's kind of a romantic but also troubling notion.
It is.
And of course, one of the most famous figures associated with this romantic image of TB is John Keats. He knew he had TB, even referring to his bloody cough as his death warrant. And his friend Shelley even linked Keats's poetic talent to his illness.
Oh, I know. And Keats's writings during his final months are heartbreaking.
You can feel his suffering, his longing for death, but also his desire to cling to life and his work. And in his Ode to a Nightingale, there's this line about youth growing pale and spectre thin and dies, which ended up being tragically prophetic.
Almost eerie.
It is. But the reality of dying from TB was far from romantic. It was often a slow and agonizing process.
Absolutely. And this romanticization wasn't limited to TB. You see it with other artists who suffered from different ailments, like Billie Holiday with her addiction and Van Gogh with his mental illness. There's this whole tortured artist trope.
It's true.
And we see this tendency in other cultures, too, like the Indian poet Sukanta Bhattacharya. He died from TB at just 20 years old. People associated his poetic talent with his illness, even though his work was very much focused on social injustice and the Bengal famine.
So it wasn't this romantic, introspective suffering.
It wasn't. And then you have someone like Masao Kashiki, a Japanese poet who also had TB. He wrote these incredibly powerful haiku about his pain, but there was no romanticizing it. He suffered for years, but he kept writing until his death.
It's such a different perspective. And, this romanticization even affected beauty standards in Europe and the US, being pale and thin with rosy cheeks and wide eyes. It became fashionable because those were signs of TB.
Wow, it's hard to believe that people actually aspired to look like they had TB.
I know. Thoreau even wrote about the hectic glow of consumption. And there are medical texts from the time praising the beauty of women with TB.
Unbelievable.
It is. There's even this famous photographer, Henry Peach Robinson, who took these photos of women like fading away. And she never told her love that depicted this idealized, fragile beauty associated with TB.
And to achieve this look, women would use belladonna to dilate their pupils and apply rouge to their cheeks.
It's amazing how much TB influenced those beauty ideals. And Green even mentions this anecdote about a woman who recently commented online, wishing she could get TB to lose weight. It shows how deeply ingrained some of those ideas still are, even if unconsciously.
That's kind of disturbing.
It is. And this romanticization also intertwined with racial prejudice. Whiteness became associated with this fine skin, and descriptions of beauty often use terms like alabaster or marble to describe this pale, almost translucent skin, which again was a symptom of TB.
It's like Eliza Poe's portrait, where her skin almost blends with the white of her dress.
Exactly. And there was even this idea of TB being a civilized disease, which implied that non-white people weren't susceptible.
It's just another way to justify racial hierarchies.
It is. But everything changed in 1882 when Robert Koch identified Mycobacterium tuberculosis as the cause of consumption.
That's right. It shifted our understanding from a vague idea of inherited weakness to a concrete infectious disease.
It was a huge turning point.
It was.
Suddenly, consumption, this somewhat romanticized affliction, became tuberculosis, this frightening contagious disease. It's like they became two different illnesses overnight, even though it was the same bacteria.
Yeah, and sadly, the racialization of TB actually intensified after Koch's discovery.
That's right. Some white doctors initially denied that black people could even get TB. And then when they saw higher rates in black communities, they attributed it to supposed biological weaknesses like smaller lung capacity, completely ignoring the social and economic inequalities that were the real cause.
That's infuriating. It is. And we can't forget the work of black physicians, like Dr. A. Wilberforce Williams, who was advocating for better housing and nutrition for black communities over a century ago.
He understood the real reasons behind those disparities.
He was ahead of his time.
He was. And sadly, TB was even used as a tool of racial violence, like the forced removal of indigenous children to residential schools, both in Canada and the US, which led to devastating TB outbreaks and deaths.
It's a dark chapter in history.
It is. And even today, there's still a stigma associated with TB. It's often linked to poverty and seen as a moral failing. People are shunned, abandoned, even told they're cursed.
It just shows how much fear and misunderstanding still surround the disease. You know, the discovery of germs and the development of germ theory had a huge impact on how we view illness.
Absolutely. It was both terrifying and hopeful. On the one hand, there's this realization that these invisible creatures can control our lives.
Right.
But on the other hand, there's this hope that science can offer solutions. Like what Pasteur said, it is within the power of man to make parasitic maladies disappear from the face of the globe.
It's a bold statement.
It is. But germ theory also challenged our anthropocentrism. Conan Doyle even described it as absurd that a human being could be defeated by a venomous little atom. It kind of puts things in perspective.
It does. It's a reminder that we're not always in control. And John Green in his book talks about his personal experience with obsessive-compulsive disorder and how his fears of contamination led him to learn about microbes. And he's fascinated by this new research on the microbiome.
Oh yeah, the idea that we're not just individuals but ecosystem.
Exactly. It makes you rethink what it even means to be human.
It does. And going back to Koch after his big discovery of the TB bacteria, he tried to develop a cure.
Right, the tuberculin.
Yeah, but it didn't work. He made premature claims of a cure and it led to many deaths and ultimately damaged his reputation. It's interesting that around the same time, Conan Doyle, who was a doctor himself, started writing about Sherlock Holmes, a character who used logic and observation to solve mysteries.
Yeah, maybe he was a bit disillusioned with the complexities of medical science and wanted to explore something more straightforward.
Maybe, and the acceptance of germ theory really changed society.
Oh, absolutely. Hygiene became a huge focus.
It did. Hemlines on dresses got shorter. Men started shaving their beards. People became obsessed with cleanliness.
All thanks to these tiny microbes we couldn't even see. And before Koch's discovery, the main cure for consumption was thought to be fresh air. Doctors would recommend sea voyages or trips to specific locations like the cypress groves in Turkey.
It sounds almost romantic.
It does, but they didn't really know what they were doing. There was no real consensus on what kind of air was best. Mountains, forests, the seaside, dry climates. It was all speculation.
It's interesting because it led to the creation of sanatoria.
Oh yeah,
These dedicated facilities for treating TB.
right. They popped up everywhere, especially in the US. People believed that certain climates were more beneficial. Some towns like Pasadena and Colorado Springs actually grew because they were seen as havens for TB patients.
It's fascinating how a disease could shape entire towns.
It is.
And life in sanatoria was very regimented. Patients, they called them invalids, spent their days resting, taking in fresh air, and following a strict routine. It's kind of like what Henry described about the Lhasa TB hospital, this interminable monotony.
Must have been so boring.
I know. And Green quotes Gail Perkins, who was sent to a sanatorium at age 3. She describes the enforced optimism, the pressure to keep a positive attitude even though she witnessed many people dying. It was like a facade.
A facade of hope.
Yeah. And while some people did recover in sanatoria, probably due to the rest in isolation, the cure rates weren't much better than for those who were treated at home.
It's more about preventing the spread, I guess.
Right. But sanatoria did play a part in the overall decline of TB in wealthy countries during the first half of the 20th century, along with things like improved nutrition and housing. And we can't forget about individuals like Dr. Henry Sewell, who worked tirelessly to find a cure and helped advance our understanding of TB through X-rays.
He was a pioneer.
He was. But the real breakthrough came with the development of effective drug treatments.
Oh yes.
It started with scientists like Paul Ehrlich and Selman Waxman, who are looking for naturally occurring antibiotics. And in 1944, Albert Schatz and Elizabeth Budgie discovered streptomycin.
That was a game changer.
It was. Its early use was a bit hit and miss, but it did contribute to the survival of people like Bob Dole, the senator who had contracted TB during the war. And the discovery of streptomycin was quickly followed by isoniazid and parazinamide.
And by the mid-1950s, they had figured out how to use these drugs in combination. And suddenly, TB was curable.
It was a moment of incredible optimism. People thought they could finally eradicate TB.
It's amazing how quickly things changed. But unfortunately, that optimism was short-lived.
It was. And a big reason for that was the failure to properly implement treatment programs in poorer countries. There was this prevailing attitude among some in wealthier nations that people in these regions were somehow incapable of adhering to treatment.
Yeah.
It was racist and paternalistic.
It's like that quote by S. Lyle Cummins, where he talked about certain populations being inherently less able to follow treatment. It's just appalling.
It is, and it's just not true. But this attitude led to inadequate funding and support for TB control programs in many parts of the world.
And that's where the DOTS strategy came in.
That's right. Directly observed treatment, short course. It was developed by the WHO to address the challenges of TB control in resource-limited settings.
And the core idea was to have healthcare workers directly observe patients taking their medication to ensure adherence.
Exactly. It was also about providing a standardized treatment regimen, ensuring a reliable drug supply, and strengthening political commitment to TB control.
It was a comprehensive approach.
It was, and it saved millions of lives.
It has.
But there's this whole debate about patient noncompliance, which is often blamed for the development of drug resistance.
Yeah. The idea that patients are just not taking their meds properly.
Right. But Dr. Jarambi Tefera has pointed out that there are so many barriers to treatment adherence in those settings. Access to clinics, the cost of transportation, unreliable drug supplies.
It's easy to blame individuals when the system itself is failing them.
Exactly. And Green even talks about his own struggles with taking medication for OCD and depression, even though he has easy access to healthcare. It's not always about willpower or a lack of understanding.
It's about acknowledging the very real challenges people face. And even the term compliance is problematic. It implies that patients should just blindly follow orders without questioning anything.
It's a power dynamic.
It is.
And while DOTS has been successful, it's not a one-size-fits-all solution. It doesn't always work for people with drug-resistant TB or for those whose treatment was interrupted like Henry.
And it raises the question, how do we view these individuals? Are they just non-compliant, or are the individuals struggling within a flawed system?
Exactly. And let's talk a bit more about this issue of drug resistance. We mentioned earlier that bacteria can mutate and become resistant to drugs.
Right.
And with TB, it's interesting because the bacteria actually grows very slowly, which means it mutates less frequently than some other bacteria.
So that's a good thing.
It is. It makes it harder for resistance to develop. However, if treatment isn't completed properly or if the wrong drugs are used, resistance can still emerge.
And we can't forget about the lack of new TB drugs for a long time. Between 1966 and 2012, there was a huge gap in drug development.
That's right. And it highlights the limitations of relying on market forces to drive medical innovation. Why would pharmaceutical companies invest heavily in developing new drugs for a disease that primarily affects poor people when they can make more money developing drugs for, say, erectile dysfunction or hair loss?
It's all about profit, not about human need.
Exactly. And the two most recent TB drugs were both developed with significant public funding. It shows that we need more investment in research for diseases that affect the most vulnerable population.